Morning, everyone. This is a session on Vue.js. Before we get started, just want to take a quick poll. How many people are currently using Vue? Okay, I'm not sure why you're in here, but it's okay. This is a fairly basic introduction to Vue. We unfortunately don't have time to cover everything. That would take about 2.5 to 3 hours, but in this session, what we're going to do is cover the basics. Here's a little bit about me, and for some reason, the bottom of the screen is cut off. Okay. The most important thing on this slide is my Twitter handle, so if you have any questions or follow-ups afterwards, you could feel free to reach out over Twitter and talk. And also, if you're just getting started in Vue, there are a couple of nice confs coming up that are going to have 3 full days of Vue content. So the first one is Connect Tech in October, and then in spring of 2019, the main Vue Conf is happening in Florida. So you can come check those out and do a workshop, whatever. All right. So our basic outline for today is why Vue.js compared to the other frameworks. We won't go too deep into comparisons, but just why is Vue interesting and good for web development. And then we'll get into Vue basics, and we'll talk about going further, stuff that we can't cover in 50 minutes in this session. So let's start off with why Vue.js, because there's a lot of options out there today. Well, there's less options, in my opinion, than there used to be. If you look back about 3 or 4 years ago, there were lots and lots of different options. You know, there was Batman.js and Kendo and blah, blah, blah. So there's lots of options out there. But what's happened so far in the developer space, or up to now, is there are 3 major frameworks today, right? Everyone knows what they are: Angular, React, and Vue. If you go look and do some Google searches or look at Google Trends or whatever, you'll find that those are definitively the top 3 that are available today. But why is Vue interesting? I think the main reason developers like Vue is because it has a very low learning curve. Right? You can get started with it very quickly, as opposed to Angular or React, where you have quite a bit that you have to learn up front. You can get started with Vue very quickly with just some basics. Essentially what we're going to cover in the next 45 minutes, you can get started with it really, really fast. And you can be productive with it very quickly as well. And that's what makes a huge difference. Right? And Vue touts itself as a progressive framework. What that means is that you can just start with the basic features you need to build a web application, and then you can add in more features that are part of the framework as add-ons or just already in the framework, and you can add them in as you need to. As your application grows in complexity, you might say to yourself, well, maybe we should start doing state management. And then in that case, what you can do is you can blend in some Vuex, which is an improved add-on into the core Vue.js library. Right? You might, at some point very quickly, say, I also need some routing. Right, in-app server-side routing. Client-side routing. In that case, you can just add on another approved Vue plugin called Vue Router. So everything in the Vue constellation is meant to work together and is meant to be as simple as possible. And I think, at least for me, what I found compared to the other frameworks is that Vue is very intuitive. There are lots of things in Vue. Once you know a handful of basics, everything else becomes very intuitive. It's very easy to get started with. It's easy to add more complex features and use more complex parts of the Vue framework because everything kind of makes sense, right? And this is the kind of gestalt around Vue, is that everything should be as simple as possible, right? As opposed to some other frameworks which tend to make things a little bit more complex than necessary, in my opinion. Okay? The other thing about Vue that's interesting is that it's 100% community supported. Angular is supported by Google, as you know. Facebook supports React, but Vue is 100% supported by the community. So there's not like a big corporation behind it. And that might give some people pause. It's like, well, if there's not a big company behind it, you know, what happens if, you know, it's all of a sudden the main developer like gets hit by a bus or something like that? But there is a very large community around Vue. They have a lot of contributors. The core Vue team is like 15 people. So, and they do take donations online to fund the support of Vue. The main Vue person, Evan Yu, he actually does this full time, just on community support, which is great. Right? So it's community supported, it's community driven. It's not backed by a big company, but everything you need in a large framework to build out your projects for work, everything you need is there. Right? You can get support. And all that other kind of stuff. All right, so we're going to dispense with the slideware for now. And, of course, doing live demos is always a lot of fun. So you'll have to bear with me if I run into some trouble. All right, so let's get out of here, and let's go pull up our editor. All right, so I have a very simple Vue application here. You can see it's displayed on the left, and in this case, I'm just using what's called a single-page Vue application. Okay, so it's just plain HTML as far as you can see, right? And we have a couple of things in here. Of course, there's the logo up here, but we have this greeting thing, right? This is welcome to your first, oops, that's not supposed to happen. Let's try that again. There. Welcome to your first Vue app. All right, let's resize this a little bit. And you can see we have a greeting here. I can go in and I can manipulate the greeting, and I can say something like, okay, we'll save that, and hopefully that reloads. Okay, so this is just something that comes out of the box. One of the core things in Vue that they have around what we're using here is essentially a bind into a template, is it has reactivity. So as I'm typing and I go and save, it instantly shows up in the browser. And most other frameworks support this as well. But what's interesting is we can come into here and we can open the console. Whoop, try opening it again. Okay, so let's go into the console. And what we can actually do here is we can do app.greeting equals hello. And I know it's very small. Right, so that's all I'm doing. I'm just in the console, and I'm going to directly try to manipulate this. Okay, let's do that again because you couldn't see it. Right, I'll just go add some other stuff. So, okay, we go hit enter, and we should get our update there. So one of the things that Vue supports, which is common, for example, in Angular, it supports two-way data binding. So what I have here inside of my Vue app declaration is I have a data segment, and inside of there I have greeting. Okay, so what we've done is we've bound that greeting string into here using mustaches, or that's what they're called, mustaches, and injecting into the template. And we can also do it like this. If we don't want to use that, we can use an attribute binding and say v.text equals greeting, and you can see that that's the equivalent. So there are certain cases where you want to use the mustaches, and there are certain cases where you want to do the semantic binding using essentially v-text. So next question might be, as we're doing this, maybe that greeting has some HTML in it, or that greeting data element, or maybe we're pulling something from a server which has some embedded HTML. So if I go into here and I make this, let's make it italics. How's that? Since we already have an H1 in there. Okay, so let's do this. And you can see when I reloaded that, we can get rid of the console now. We don't need that. You can see that it actually just displays the text inline, or the HTML inline. So in this case, what we have to do, when we want to inject some HTML, is instead of using v-text, we can just say v-html, and that signals to the framework that we have some embedded HTML in here. Right? So you can see what it does is it doesn't escape. It basically shows the raw HTML. And this is a little cut off, but that's okay. Okay, so a couple of tags that we've used already. Now, let's go change this. Well, we can leave this for now. And if we want to add more data elements, we can say something like time and do new date, like so. And let's save that, make sure it doesn't blow up. Then we can come into here, and I'm just going to copy paste this because I'm lazy. Say text, and this is the time, and we should have the time now. Okay, now that time doesn't look so great. So there are two ways that we could go and make this look a little bit better, right? So I'm going to get rid of the binding for now, and I'm going to use mustaches here, and we can directly do something like this if we wanted to, right? So we're basically writing JavaScript inside of the mustache template here. You can't do that with the bind, obviously, or the v-text, but with this we can go ahead and put an expression in here. And this is also at the heart of one of the things that's at the core of Vue, which is the ability to use JavaScript expression. If you don't know what an expression is basically just some JavaScript code that returns some kind of value. Right? So what we can say here is we're showing the time, and we can say, let's create a new variable called time of day, and we'll just give it a number like 12. Right, so what we can do here is if we want to show the time, but only after 12 o'clock, for example, we can say v-if equals, and inside of here we'll say time, oops, my mouse jumped there, time is greater than 12, then show that string, and of course that's false because we have the time set, oh, sorry, wrong variable. Let's do this, okay? So we can say if time of day is greater than 12, then show the time string for whatever reason. Okay, so if we go and save that, you'll see now the time string is gone. But if I come into here and I make this 13, you'll see that it shows up. So what we're doing here is we're using an expression inside of a semantic bind, right? We also are able to use an expression directly in the template if we wanted to as well, right? So what this v-if does, it basically says if it's, if time of day is greater than 12, then go run this. And you can probably imagine what's coming next. So let's just say that it's afternoon for that, if time of day is greater than 12. Then what we can also put here is we can say v-if-else. If time of day is less than 12, we can say it's morning. Okay, so let's go save this, and we'll get the same. Well, that didn't work, obviously, for some reason. Let's try this again. Okay, we'll come back to this in a bit. All right, so this is the basics of Vue. Basically, we have a template that we put into our application. If we go explore what's inside of our Vue app here, you can see that we've created an app. This EL is where this is bound to. In this case, our Vue application is mounted into this specific div. Okay? And we'll get into some other things that you can put in here, but let's get back to our slide where for a few minutes and talk about some of the things that we've already explored in the code. So a Vue app can be in one file, if you want it to be. Right? This is not typically how you would develop a Vue application, but if you're just doing some exploration or some prototyping, you can put everything into one file. What we normally do in a Vue application is we split things into components in multiple files so that basically you don't have a massive file with multiple components in it and becomes unwieldy, right? We're not doing JSPs here. So everyone remembers if you worked 10 or 15 years ago in Java web applications, all the rage was to use JSPs, and you have a massive JSP file with 4,000 lines that nobody ever wanted to touch, right? So we still want to not do that. And what we do with Vue to make that better is we use the component-based model that Vue provides. And let me just show you a quick example right here in the background. Right? So this is a more modern Vue application. So the way that this was actually built out was you install the Vue CLI and you say Vue CLI init, and you give it a name, and then asks you a bunch of questions. Specifically, one of the questions it will ask you is what template do you want to base this new application on? And in this case, what we're doing is we're saying we want a not simple, but a Webpack-based template that is modeled as components. So let's have a quick look at how this is actually put together. Okay, we're also using a router here. We'll come back to the router in a bit. But in this specific Vue app, right, so we have our app here. We have our router, which defines what's our root component. And then if we go to the component itself, you'll see that instead of having the HTML tag and the other things that we had previously, right, you can see there's doc type, HTML, head, etc. What we do is we declare that this is a template, and we have our template in here with HTML, and you can see there's Vue, v-if, etc. And if we scroll down to the bottom, this is using ES6. In the previous example, we could only nominally use ES5 because it's running, quote-unquote, directly in the browser and not going through a processing phase where we can do a conversion from ES6 to ES5. But in this specific template that we're using, we are using ES6, so we say export default. This is the name of the component, and instead of just being a raw JavaScript object, when we build a Vue component, the data function has to return essentially an object. So instead of just being a raw JavaScript object, our data and our methods and other things that we'll explore in a few minutes has to be a function, as you can see here. Okay, all right. So some subtle differences between straight Vue in the browser and a more complex example using component-based Vue. All right. So the way that this typically works is we have a Vue instance which we created. You saw that we did new Vue, and we have templates, and then we have multiple things inside of our Vue object declaration. We looked at data already. We'll get into methods, filters, and a few other things as we have time. But let's talk more about the data property, right? We've already seen that, and what does it actually do? Now, one of the interesting things about the way we think about how we structure our components in Vue is at design time or development time, we think of the data property as essentially our schema for the component. Okay, so we have the data property, it is our schema, and at runtime, that data property becomes our model that we can go use in our template, right? Now, an interesting thing about this is that you can't go manipulate the data property after the component has been instantiated. Okay? So you might think, well, maybe I want to add something in at runtime. Well, that's not how it works, unfortunately, because what Vue does underneath the hood is it does an object.freeze against that data property, and then you have access to it, but as part of setting up that data property, it goes in and adds getters and setters and basically makes that data property or that data object that you have reactive, and that is specifically needed for two-way data binding. So existing properties can be modified, but you cannot add or remove properties at runtime. Okay, so it's kind of like just specking out a data object, or in Java, Pojo, if you want to think of it like that. But you can't add or delete something once you have it inside of the data property. Okay, so we've already seen a data prop. We'll skip that. Data property values can only be primitives. You can't have some kind of JavaScript object or just make up a JavaScript object and put it into there, right? But the data property values can be numbers, strings, dates, arrays, etc. Essentially, what we would think of as primitive types. But you cannot put a JavaScript object into there. So if for example, if you're using something like Backbone in a legacy application, and you want to convert that into a Vue app, you can't just take your Backbone model objects and throw them in as values in your data property, because unfortunately, Vue does not work with JavaScript objects for a couple of reasons. The main thing is that at runtime, Vue goes in and converts those values into reactive values with getters and setters for the ability to do two-way data binding. Okay. Speaking of data binding, let's get into this for a bit. You saw already that we bound data to content. We can also bind data to HTML attributes, right? This is something that you commonly have to do when you're building an application. So we can say, let's say that we wanted this thing right here, the URL for the image source, to be something that is a data prop. So we can come into here, and we can say URL logo or something. Okay, and let's put that into here. And then what we have to do is we can do view source equals URL logo. Okay, and of course that's not going to work. Why is this syntax not working? Okay, well, demo fail. We'll get to that in just a minute. All right, so there are two different ways. We saw the semantic way of using mustaches and declarative using v-text. Here's an example of it that we saw. We talked about JavaScript expressions, something that returns a value that we can use inside of a Vue template. And of course, we've already discussed this briefly, but bindings are two ways. So as something changes in the data, it's automatically reflected inside of the Vue data property. And if we go to another quick example here, this is going to be fun. Okay, so this is a more complex example using a form. Let's make this a little bit bigger. But in this specific example, you can see I have the name set to this, and that's what shows up when we bind this. But one of the things is that since Vue is reactive, right, you can see I'm printing it out right here using just a standard mustache. If I came into here and cleared that out, you can see that it immediately is reflected down here. So we can put my name, and you can see as I'm typing that, because we have this bound using a standard v-model, we get that reactivity and that two-way data binding. Okay? So in this specific case, when we do a v-model, we're signaling to Vue that, hey, this specific property should be reactive, so when it changes inside of in this case, inside of the form element, it's reflected down into the data property. And when that changes, because we also have it bound here for display purposes, it goes and changes that as well as we make changes to it. Okay? So bindings are two-way. And it's not necessarily magic. We discussed a little bit about how it actually works. Again, what Vue does underneath the hood is it takes those data properties, it adds getters and setters, and essentially does a watch on it so that whenever it changes either in the browser or in the data, or you saw we manipulated in the console, it will go and reflect all those changes everywhere where that specific property is bound. Okay? And sometimes you don't want to do a two-way data binding. Maybe you just want to just show it once and you know it's never going to change. For example, the greeting we had is probably not going to change, or it's not going to change at runtime at least. And in that case, what we do is we would use v-once. And the reason why we would use v-once instead of just using a standard v-text or using a semantic template binding is because when we go and use the v-model and we set up that two-way data binding, it adds overhead to the overall Vue application. So v-once is more for performance reasons rather than for, well, we know it's not going to change, right? So if we have properties that aren't going to change, we should use v-once so that we try to limit the amount of overhead that's in our Vue application. Okay, and that's what a v-one looks like. This message will never change. So only renders once and it improves performance. We saw this already, the v-HTML. And what this does underneath the hood, actually, when we have v-HTML and we have some embedded HTML in the data property that we wish to show, what Vue's actually doing is it goes and updates the inner HTML itself. And of course, it's used to insert raw HTML. But we have to be careful about this because we don't just want to inject any HTML into our Vue application because that can be a little bit of a security risk, right? So we have to make sure that whatever HTML we're putting in using v-HTML is something that we know is secure and doesn't do anything funny, right? And we've already seen an example of this. So one thing to note also about v-HTML is that once you use this inside of a tag, anything that's nested underneath it can no longer have bindings to it. Okay, so you can't have a v-HTML and then embedded inside of there have something else and do a v-text or a mustache or whatever. That won't work. Okay, so you have to be careful that you don't nest bindings inside of v-HTML because that is not allowed. All right, so let's get to binding tag attributes. What we do in this case is we use something called v-bind, specifically around attributes. And this is what it looks like. This is what I was trying to do earlier, but failed miserably, obviously. What we do is we say v-bind for this anchor tag, the href, to be this thing right here. Okay? And we can also do shorthand here, where instead of using the v-bind, we can say colon, and then the attribute name and what value we wish to give it. Okay? So this is how we bind into HTML attributes rather than the content itself that's in the tag. All right, so with the v-bind and the v-text and all those other things, this is what we refer to in the Vue world as directives. These are special attributes with the v-prefix. And again, what we expect to have inside of the value for a directive is a JavaScript expression. So you saw previously we basically just had a simple value. It doesn't have to be that. We could also go in and, for example, switch back to our simpler demo here. Okay. And so over here we have Hello DevOps UK. We can come into here, and we're using the new date here, so we're returning that. Let's create something else here. Right. So okay. So you can see that for this time of day that we're using right here, we can also go and have a function inside of it rather than just a straight value. Okay? So we expect a single JavaScript expression inside of here. We can also take an argument, and we can also take modifiers inside of binding attributes. So let's have a look at what that actually means. All right? So there are these things called modifiers. So say, for example, we have a form. We can say on submit, we want to prevent propagation of that event further up the chain inside of the HTML. So what we can say in this case is say submit is standard, so we don't have to have prevent there, but we can put a modifier here that prevents event propagation for this specific thing. The other thing that we can also do is the modifiers for values such as trim and other things like that. We'll get to that in just a minute. So one thing to also note is when we have these HTML bindings, what we can do is instead of doing v-on for everything, we can also just use an @ for those attribute bindings. So you can see here some shorthand, or this is the full syntax, and for these kinds of things we can do :href. For events we can do @ instead of having to do v-on everywhere inside of our application. All right, so we've looked at binding basic values into Vue templates and Vue tags. How do we also do CSS binding? So there are a couple of different strategies around doing this. We can use a JavaScript array or a JavaScript object when we need to bind styles or CSS. So let's have a look at what this actually looks like. So if we're going to directly declare a style in here, we can say v-bind style, and then we can say color, app name, and then we can say top is 20, right? So the top is actually just directly specified here. So we say top : and we just give it a value. But this color : app color name is something that we can pull from the data property that's inside of this Vue application. Okay? So this is one way to do it, right? So we're directly binding a style, or we're directly declaring a style inside of our Vue application or inside of this tag. All right? The other way that we can do this is we can also say bind a style, and here's an array that we give it of two different data properties. We could say this is greeting style and this is header, and then if we go look at what this looks like right here, you can see we have greeting : and then color is green, and then the header : font size, etc. Okay, so what we're saying in this case is we want to bind two data properties, greeting style, header, and this is where we declare them, and this just comes from the data. Okay? However, we don't typically use that kind of declaration of a style when we're writing. It doesn't matter what framework we're using, right? We don't typically declare stuff directly in the style because it's not scalable and it kind of gets messy and things like that. What we prefer to do is put stylings where they belong, which is in CSS. Okay? So we can just do a direct CSS class binding in a similar way, using a JavaScript array or a JavaScript object. Right? So in this case, what we have here at the top is we say image, and again, we're using the shorthand with the colon, and we say logo, :true, hide, not show logo. Okay, so let's have a look at what this actually does. Inside of the CSS, we have .logo defined. Again, this is in the CSS file or inside of the Vue component itself. We say the width is that, and then .hide display : none. Okay, and let's actually have a look at this inside of the code itself. Okay, so here's our example. Let's go pull this up real quick. All right, so let's go find our class declaration. Make sure I'm in the right file. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. Okay. So what we can do in this case, again, is we have our image class. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Okay, we have our image class, or image tag. We have class, and we say logo : true, hide, not show logo. And if we go into our data property, we can see we have show logo here set to true initially. So if I go in and set this to false, one of these logos or the logos will disappear. Right? And again, what we're doing is inside of this Vue component, we have a block where we can actually define the style. So there are a couple of different strategies for doing this. A lot of times what we do when we do web dev inside of a framework is we have separate CSS files that live over here, right? Somewhere else, basically not inside of the component that we're working in. What we like to do in Vue is we like to have our styles, our functions, and our data properties, and our templates all within the same file like we have here. Because what that does is that encapsulates everything we need for that component inside of one file. So we don't have to open 3 or 4 different files just to go and manipulate something or change something that we have in a Vue component. Everything is supposed to be enclosed inside of a single file so that we have access to it directly within that file, and we get kind of encapsulation around that specific component. It doesn't have any external dependencies, so that if something changes over here, all of a sudden our Vue component has changed too. Okay? So what we do in this case when we use this object way of declaring a class is, again, we have this logo that is down here. You can see we have .logo width of 50, and we just say we want that thing to be true, right? So that basically signals to Vue that as you're constructing this specific component, if that CSS class is set to true, it will basically materialize inside of that tag, right? And if we go look at how this show logo works, what we're doing again is this hide references this CSS class called .hide, and you can see the way we're hiding is we're just saying display none. In this specific case, we have another data property called show logo, which we can set to true or false. And of course, because Vue is reactive, when we go manipulate this, it will actually go and basically update it for us. Okay? And the other way we could have done this, if we wanted to not use this specific way of saying this, is again, we could have just put in a v-if and say, only show this if the show logo is set to true. So this is using CSS up here to go and hide the logo, and this is using a v-if to hide the logo, but it's not using CSS underneath the hood. What happens in the v-if case is that it actually removes that image tag from the actual DOM. In the first case up here, we keep that image tag in the DOM, but we just flip the display none to not true or false to show it and not show it. But in the first case here, this is going to be in the HTML, but it'll just be hidden, right? Display is set to none. In this case, when we do this with the v-if, it actually removes that element from the actual DOM. Okay. All right. So let's get back to our slides. Let's make sure we've covered everything. So that's our CSS, our image class, a couple of different ways to do it. So let's talk about expressions for a little while. One thing to note about the JavaScript expressions that you use inside of Vue is that it runs in an isolated container inside of that specific Vue context. So you only have access to a limited set of globals. And the reason that this is an isolated environment, again, speaks to the encapsulation of a Vue component. You have everything you need inside of a Vue component. You try to keep everything inside of that component and not have external dependencies. So similarly, when you're writing JavaScript expressions, you only have access to what is in that Vue component itself. Okay? So you don't have access to globals necessarily. There are a limited set of globals that you can use that are defined for a Vue application or a Vue component. Right? So we've already talked about this, so I'm not going to go into this too much more. But let's jump into forms for a bit as well. So we saw an example of this with v-model. And so if we pull up our application here, let's go back to this thing right here. Okay, and let's look at actually how a form works. Okay, so this is number 7. Let's make sure this works properly. We have our form here. And a couple of things to note here. All right, instead of using a v-text, what we're doing is, in this case, we're saying use a v-model. And again, what this does inside of a Vue application is it sets up all the reactive parts of Vue so that as we change something in the form, make this a little smaller, right? So for example, if we go and change the email, whatever, you can see that we get a reactive update here where we are showing that specific type of data property, right? So there's a presenter email. You can see I'm printing everything out here. But one other thing that we have in here is we're using a standard form, and in this case what we're saying is when the form is submitted, prevent propagation, and then go run this thing right here called process data. So what is that process data thing? Right, we've so far only had a data element inside of our Vue object. Now we're going to add in something called methods. And this is a place where we can go and throw different methods to do whatever we want to in our application. In this specific case, this is how we would process the data and post it to a server or something like that, right? But if I were to hit submit here, what would happen is that should show up in, let's take some of these. Okay, you can see, well, you can't see because it's too small, but you can see we directly printed out the form app, and this is our name, presenter, email, etc. Right? So it actually got those properties and showed them as we hit. When we do a submit, process data, it goes and run this. And we don't actually need to have this form inside of here. So we don't actually need to return this form object that we created inside of our data, right? So this is how we would typically structure data for a form, is we just put it in a container object like this, and we say form, colon, name, et cetera, instead of just having it as top-level variables inside of our data. So we have our form, and if we didn't pass this in, we could just say this.form data. Okay, let's wait for that to update. And what that would do is that would basically print out, it would go and get, it helps if you use the right variable, this.form. It would go and get that specific object out of the data and grab those values as we need it. So we don't actually need to pass a parameter, but we can if we need to. And sometimes you may need to pass multiple parameters. So say, for example, when we're submitting this form, we also need to go and send in some kind of OAuth token or something like that. So we could go and directly inject a token into here, and that would be passed into the function then, and then we can get what we need out of it. And sometimes maybe we want the event itself. So the way that the methods work inside of, specifically when we're doing something like a submit with the v-on, right? So this is just a click, basically. The last thing that we have inside of the list of parameters is the event object itself. So if we wanted to go get stuff out of the event object, what we would do, so if we look at the signature here, what we have is we say process data. This is some OAuth token or something that we need to pass in to the object itself or to the function. And say we also need the event, then our method signature down here would be token, comma, event. And then we could go and use this in some way, right? So we could say alert event, and that should show our event. Let's go try that real quick. And you can see, well, in this case, it just says undefined. But because we're not actually passing anything in, right? So, but we can pass multiple parameters into here just by adding them, and then the event is the last one that will get passed in, okay? So, and it's implicit, so we don't actually even need to say that, pass the event in. It will just happen like this. All right. So two-way data binding, models. What the V model does, as we've talked about briefly, is it tracks the value of that specific property. It listens for inputs, and it updates the model or that property wherever it is declared inside of the application. Okay? And actually, let's have a look at how we would do some other things inside of our form. Okay? So say we're getting a list of different options that we wish to show in a checkbox. Right? So we have an array of just strings here for different options that we need to show. Right? So basically, what are the tracks for this conference or whatever? So if we go and look at our template now, instead of actually writing each one out, what we could do is we can use something called v-for, which is right here, and we can say for all the options, bind it to this locally scoped variable called option, and then we can use a mustache template to actually show that specific thing. Okay, so the v-for is what we use inside of Vue to go and loop over something, and it will go and generate whatever this top-level label is and the contained HTML elements inside of it. Okay, so we can say, here's the options. set the value, and you can see we're using v-model form.track. If we go and complete this example, form track is an array. So as we go through and click these things, you'll see that they appear in the view because we're just displaying everything that we have in our form on the screen as well, or inside of the web page. Okay? So v-for used for looping and displaying multiple values or whatever you need to do, right? So if you need to populate a table, show some options like this in the checkbox or select tag or something, you can use view. Sorry. All right. We've talked about all this already. Next thing we want to talk about briefly is modifiers. So one thing that we can do when we get form data back is we can go and apply some things to it to help us make the data more appropriate. So you can say v-model.trim, v-model.number, which does a conversion from a string into a number, right? This is something you typically have to do. And then the last modifier here is interesting. What this does is this is what's called a lazy update modifier. So if you remember, Vue is reactive. So whenever we went and changed something in here, right? So if I go and change something, well, you can't see it because it's bottom. Right, so if I go into here, and because I have this set as a model, every time I type something, it's going and modifying this. Right, so that may be adding too much overhead and may cause a performance issue. So what we can do in this case, instead of getting everything like as we're typing it for every little change that we make, we can just add v-model.lazy. And what that signals to Vue is, well, don't make it reactive for every change that happens inside of it. Only fire change when focus is lost on that specific input. So if we were to add v-model.lazy into here, so where's my name at? Okay, we could say .lazy. Okay, let's go save that. Let's go rerun it. And now as I type, you can see this is not changing. But as soon as this text area loses focus, it gets updated. Okay, so there's certain use cases which this is good for, right? So for example, if you have like a search input, as somebody's typing, you don't want to go hit the server over and over again, right? You may want to only hit the server once that area loses focus or once someone submits or something like that. So you can say, make this lazy and don't fire an event every time someone types a letter inside of that text input. All right, and we can also chain these things together. So we can say v-model.lazy.trim if we wanted to trim the white space around it and also make it lazy. Okay, so let's talk about event handlers quickly. We've seen some already. So we use v-on to signify that we want to listen for certain kinds of events that are coming in from the DOM. All right, and the v-on essentially maps the standard DOM events that are already there, but it allows Vue to go and inject itself and do whatever the framework needs to do to be able to capture those events. And we quickly discussed how we could also pass parameters. Right, so this is what it looks like. And again, there's two different ways to do this. We could do v-on :click, or we could just say @click, and that's the equivalent syntax in Vue. All right, we'll come back to events if we have some time. We don't really have a lot of time left, so there's a few other things we want to talk about before we wrap up. So we also have, as you saw previously, you can do conditionals with v-if, v-else, v-else-if, etc. And we're not going to get into v-show for now. It's going to be a little bit, take a little bit of time, and we want to skip over that. But we've seen this already. We say v-if show logo equals true, go and show it. And we don't technically need that equals true in there because it will just evaluate that show logo data property for us. And if it returns true or false, it'll do the appropriate thing. All right, we talked about loops already. All right, how do we do a loop? One thing to note that we didn't discuss already is that we were just using like kind of a plain loop over this thing, and this is the property that we're binding it to, scoped inside of these sets of tags. But sometimes you may also need access to the key and the index. So in this case, what we do is we use a parentheses, and we say value, key, index, and URLs, and then we can go use that inside of the Vue template as we need to. All right, so real quick, let's talk about some of the modifiers that we have around events. We already talked about the prevent, which basically allows it to not bubble up. We can also say stop the event at this specific location in the DOM tree. We can also say only fire this event inside of itself. And we can also use this modifier called once, which means only fire this event once in the component and never again. Okay. And when we're talking about key events, this is fairly easy to do in Vue as well. We can say v-on, key up, dot enter, go and run this thing. And we have these pre-built keywords for different keys like enter, tab, delete, escape, space, up, down, left, right, etc. that we can bind to by using the syntax that we have here at the top. V-on, key up, dot enter, v-on, key down, dot tab, or whatever. Okay? So we have different things we can do around this. Similarly, for mouse events, we can say v-on, mouse down, dot right, so i.e. when the right mouse button is clicked, or when it goes down specifically, go run this function. And we also have a special one that we can use to fire up a context menu, so we can say v-on when the user wants to hit the right mouse button and we want to show a context menu, we can go and do this instead of doing mouse down dot right if we want to do that. Okay, to show a context menu. Okay. So let's talk about going further. There's a bunch of stuff we didn't cover. There's something called watchers, which allows us programmatically inside of our Vue object to go and watch a specific data element or a data property. And when it changes, we can go and do something, right? So that's called a watcher. That's not supposed to be computer properties. I apologize. This one here on the bottom should be computed properties. And what computed properties are is that sometimes when you're writing an application, you may not want to go and update something, a data element, over and over again. What you may want to do is just cache it, right? So you may say, okay, this is an OAuth token that we have. Let's store that as a computed property, and we can go and get that whenever we need. And if we need to update it at some point in the future, we can go update it. But basically, a computed property is like a data property, except it's cached and it doesn't necessarily change every time you change it when you need to programmatically. Right? So something else that we didn't also cover is called filters. So what we can do inside of a mustache template is we can say we have a result. Let's go fire a function that removes the space, and let's go change that string to be title case or whatever. So we can change these filters together to do some low-level manipulation of data directly inside of the template. And we could do it in the method, we'd do it in a watch or something, but we can also just do it directly inside of the template using this mustache syntax. Right? The other thing that we didn't talk about in much detail were the components. Right? We looked at a quick example where we had a more sophisticated project where we were using components. And again, if we look at this, you can see the key difference is that this is not like a fully formed HTML file. It uses template instead of HTML. The rest of this is pretty much the same. The only other key difference that we also discussed briefly is that because this is a component and not a single page Vue app, we have to have the data as a function to return the data back. And the reason why this can't just be a property and has to be a function is because we need to get an instance of the data property and the stuff contained within it, because a Vue component can be instantiated multiple times. So we don't have data sharing between Vue components. Each Vue component only keeps the data that it is responsible for inside of the instance. So that's one of the key differences between just a standard single-page Vue app and a Vue component. But we can use this Vue component with standard JavaScript. So let's go into here real quick. So we were using Hello World, and see we're using some ES6 here. We say import hello world component from this specific file, and then we can just use that. In this case, we're using routing. Okay, and while we're here, let's talk about routing very quickly. There is a approved routing library called Vue Router. You can import that into your project. And then setting this up is relatively simple. You can probably guess how this works just by looking at it. We give it routes. Here's the path to the route, and here's the name of that specific route and which instantiated component we should use for that route. Okay. Let's get back to our slides. We have a few minutes left. And something we didn't have time to talk about here is Vuex. So once your application gets complex enough, you probably want to think about having state management for your overall application, and that's what Vuex allows you to do. Right? So once you have multiple components that may or may not need to share data, you can use something like Vuex to essentially send data to different components as needed. And so we talked about routing very quickly. And another thing that's quite common that can also be built into Vue using a separate library is server-side rendering. So sometimes you may not want to have everything go and run directly in the browser. Sometimes you may want to actually do a server render and just post HTML up or send HTML up to the browser. So this is a common technique across multiple different types of frameworks. So Angular supports this, and so does React. And Vue supports it as well in a couple of different ways. Okay. And we've talked about the modifiers already, and I have 30 seconds left for questions. So, right. So, anyways, there are a couple of different things that you can use to learn Vue. Obviously, there's a bunch of people who sell like kind of videos and workshops and stuff like that. But in my opinion, Vue is so straightforward that you can just go to the docs, and the docs are excellent for Vue. There's a reference to the Vue docs on this slide. You can just go to the docs, and you can basically learn everything you need to just by reading the documentation, because Vue is pretty simple, and they have a really good documentation. So, okay, and time's up, so I'm going to stop talking now. If you have questions, I'll be here for a little while, so you're welcome to come up and discuss if you want. Thanks for coming, everyone.